The rain poured mercilessly, blurring the headlights of passing cars as Harper Rose squinted into the darkness of the empty highway. She wrapped her thin jacket tighter around herself, the cold seeping into her bones. It had been a long shift at the diner, and all she wanted was to get home to her sister, Lily. The thought of Lily's bright smile gave her the strength to keep walking despite the miserable weather. A sudden screech and a crash pulled her from her thoughts. Ahead, a sleek black car skidded off the wet road, its headlights dipping into the shallow ditch. Harper hesitated for a split second before her instincts kicked in. She sprinted toward the wreck, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles. As she approached, the driver's door creaked open, and a man stumbled out, holding his shoulder. He was tall, with sharp features that seemed even more pronounced under the dim light. His tailored suit was now soaked and muddied. "Are you hurt?" Harper called out, her voice cutting through the rain. The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his grimace betrayed the truth. "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to his forehead, where a thin trickle of blood mixed with the rain. He waved her off. "I don't need help." Ignoring his protest, Harper stepped closer. "You could be seriously hurt. Let me check." There was no hesitation in her tone, just genuine concern. For a moment, the man seemed caught off guard by her insistence. She pulled a crumpled napkin from her bag and pressed it gently to his forehead. He flinched but didn't pull away. "You're stubborn," he muttered, though there was a trace of something softer in his voice. "I've been called worse," she replied with a faint smile, not looking up as she worked. As she bandaged his wound with a makeshift strip of fabric torn from her own scarf, she noticed the quiet tension in his posture. He was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but too pragmatic to push her away entirely. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Ethan," he said curtly. "Ethan Whitmore." The name rang a faint bell, but Harper was too focused on the task at hand to dwell on it. "Well, Ethan, your car's not going anywhere tonight. Do you have someone you can call?" His jaw tightened. "No." Harper raised an eyebrow. "No? No friends? No family?" Ethan's silence was answer enough. She sighed and glanced at the dark highway. "There's a gas station a couple of miles back. I can walk there and call for help." "I'll drive you," Ethan said, gesturing toward his car. "Drive me?" Harper gave him a skeptical look. "You just crashed. The engine's fine. It's just a little." He stopped himself, realizing how ridiculous he sounded. For the first time, a flicker of humility crossed his face. "Fine. Let me at least give you a ride home." Harper hesitated. Every instinct told her not to get into a car with a stranger, but the look in his eyes wasn't threatening. If anything, it was guarded, like he was more afraid of her than she was of him. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but only to the edge of town." The ride was quiet, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic beat of the wipers filling the silence. Harper stole glances at Ethan, noting the tension in his grip on the steering wheel and the faint lines of exhaustion on his face. He wasn't what she expected, wealthy, obviously, but not arrogant in the way she'd imagined someone like him would be. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "what brings you out here in the middle of nowhere?" He hesitated, then replied, "Work. Must be important if you're driving through a storm like this." His lips quirked in a humorless smile. "It always is." Harper didn't push further, sensing he wasn't the type to open up easily. Instead, she let the silence settle again, focusing on the road ahead. The tension between them wasn't hostile, but it was tangible, a mix of curiosity and wariness on both sides. When they reached the edge of town, Harper gestured for him to stop. "This is me," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Ethan glanced out the window at the modest street lined with small houses. "You live around here?" "Yeah," she replied, stepping out into the rain. "Thanks for the ride." Before she could shut the door, he called after her. "You could have just walked away back there. Why didn't you?" Harper paused, meeting his gaze. "Because you needed help." Her answer hung in the air as she closed the door and hurried toward her house. Ethan watched her go, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. For the first time in a long while, someone had treated him like a person rather than a transaction. It was unsettling and oddly intriguing. As the rain continued to fall, Ethan drove off, his thoughts lingering on the strange woman who had seen through his defenses without even trying. Ethan Whitmore stepped into his mansion, the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne greeting him like an old, predictable acquaintance. The grand foyer stretched before him, its cold marble floors and towering ceilings reflecting the solitude that had defined his life for years. He tossed his keys onto a nearby table, his mind unwillingly drifting back to the stormy highway and the woman who had tended to him without hesitation. Harper Rose. There was something disarming about her, something that lingered just beneath the surface. Her face, soft yet resolute, flashed in his thoughts as he ascended the grand staircase. Ethan shook his head, as though clearing her image could bring back his usual focus. Upstairs, Margaret Whitmore waited in the study, her presence as imposing as the decor. She sat in one of the leather armchairs, her manicured fingers tapping against the armrest. "You're late," she said coolly, her sharp eyes narrowing on him. Ethan loosened his tie, unbothered by her tone. "I was delayed." "Delayed?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice taking on a cutting edge. "We don't have time for delays. The board is restless, Ethan. You know what's at stake if you don't fulfill the marriage clause." He sank into the opposite chair, his expression impassive. "I'm aware. Then why haven't you acted? You're playing with fire, and the clock is ticking." She folded her arms, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "Unless you've already found someone suitable?" Ethan didn't answer, instead gazing at the framed photo on the desk, a picture of his late father, whose shadow loomed over every corner of his life. Margaret took his silence as an opening to press further. "Think carefully, Ethan," she said. "If you let this opportunity slip, everything your father built could be dismantled. Choose someone, anyone, and make it work." Her words followed him even after she left, echoing through the halls as he retreated to his study. Sitting at his desk, Ethan stared out at the rain streaking the window, his mind drifting back to Harper's small act of kindness. She had no reason to stop and help him, no obligation to care. Yet she had. Across town, Harper sat at the tiny kitchen table in her modest apartment, sorting through medical bills. Lily's laughter rang from the next room, a bright contrast to Harper's furrowed brow. The burden was hers alone to bear, but she wouldn't let it crush her, not while Lily needed her. Unknowingly, both Ethan and Harper were bound by the weight of their worlds, their lives poised to collide once more. And this time, neither would walk away unchanged. Harper shifted uncomfortably in the high-backed chair, the leather cool against her skin. The sheer grandeur of Ethan Whitmore's private office made her feel out of place, like she didn't belong. The walls were lined with dark wood shelves, filled with books whose spines gleamed under the dim light. A large desk sat at the room's center, and behind it, Ethan stood, his gaze unwavering as he looked at her. "Why am I here?" Harper asked, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Ethan exhaled, stepping away from the desk. "I'm about to propose a business arrangement." Harper's eyebrows shot up. "Eh, what?" He sat across from her, his posture calculated, every movement deliberate. "I need a wife, temporarily at least. 2 years. It's not romantic, it's not conventional, but it's necessary." Harper blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "You're joking." "I'm not," Ethan replied, his tone clipped but devoid of mockery. "There's a clause in my father's will. If I don't marry by a certain date, control of the company goes to someone less capable." His expression hardened, though a flicker of something softer passed across his face. "This arrangement would benefit us both." Harper leaned back, crossing her arms. "How exactly do I benefit from pretending to be your wife?" "I'm offering financial security," Ethan said plainly. "Enough to cover your sister's medical expenses, your rent, your debts, everything." The mention of Lily stopped Harper's retort mid-breath. Her mind raced, replaying every unpaid bill and late-night worry. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing unease Ethan's offer sparked. "And in exchange, I'm supposed to what? Smile at your parties? Pretend we're in love?" "You'd attend a few events, yes," Ethan admitted, his tone softening slightly. "But more than that, you'd be giving me what I need to secure my legacy. And in return, You'll have the freedom to focus on what matters most to you." Harper stared at him, her emotions a tangled mix of disbelief, anger, and something she couldn't quite place. He was cold, pragmatic, but not unkind. The offer wasn't made with malice. It was a calculation, a solution. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "There's not much time," Ethan replied, though he didn't push. "But I won't force you. The decision is yours." As Harper left the mansion, the weight of his proposal pressed heavily on her. She thought of Lily's laughter, her small hands clutching Harper's tightly. She wasn't sure what scared her more, stepping into Ethan's world or walking away from a chance to change hers. Harper stepped hesitantly into the grand foyer of Ethan's mansion, the same space that had intimidated her on her first visit. This time, though, the sense of permanence made the walls feel taller, the space more suffocating. Her modest suitcase, a stark contrast to the opulence around her, seemed to echo her every step as she followed the housekeeper down the marble corridor. The staff's sidelong glances didn't go unnoticed. Harper felt their judgment in the way they whispered as she passed, their expressions polite but cold. She knew what they were thinking, what everyone was likely thinking. The working-class woman who had somehow ensnared a billionaire. Her jaw tightened as she clutched the strap of her bag, willing herself not to shrink under their scrutiny. By the time she reached the room that was to be hers, Harper felt the weight of every step. It was spacious, with elegant furnishings and a view that overlooked the sprawling gardens, but it felt more like a gilded cage than a haven. "Do you need anything else, miss?" the housekeeper asked, her tone devoid of warmth. Harper forced a smile. "No, thank you." Once alone, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the rain streaking the windows. She reminded herself why she was here. Lily? Her little sister's face filled her mind, and for a moment, it eased the knot in her stomach. Later that evening, Harper braved the dining room. Ethan was already seated, his sharp gaze softening when he saw her. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his voice neutral but laced with an undertone of concern. "It's an adjustment," Harper admitted, glancing at the perfectly arranged table that seemed more suited for a royal banquet than a casual dinner. Ethan nodded, as if he'd expected her answer. He gestured to the server and waited until they were alone. "If there's anything you need, let me know." His words were simple, but the sincerity in them surprised her. He wasn't overly expressive. He never was. But the small act of ensuring her comfort didn't go unnoticed. The reprieve didn't last long. The next morning, Harper woke to her name splashed across tabloids. "Billionaire Ethan Whitmore marries mystery woman." The headlines speculated about her background, her intentions, and her worthiness. Harper's stomach churned as she read the sensationalized stories. When Ethan found her in the study, the article still clutched in her hand, he sighed. "It was inevitable," he said. His expression was calm, but his voice held a hint of frustration. "Ignore it. They don't know you." Harper wasn't sure what stung more, the headlines or the realization that, to everyone else, she would always be a mystery, a puzzle they didn't think belonged in this world. The chandelier cast a warm, glittering light over the grand dining hall, where the hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of glasses. Harper adjusted the straps of her elegant but borrowed dress, feeling out of place among the guests. The room was filled with power brokers and socialites, their laughter too loud and their smiles too sharp. She forced herself to stay calm, remembering Ethan's quiet reassurance earlier. "You don't need to impress anyone here." Ethan stood a few feet away, engaged in a conversation with a senator. His posture was relaxed, but his sharp eyes occasionally flickered toward Harper, as if ensuring she wasn't overwhelmed. Harper appreciated the subtle gesture, but the weight of the evening still pressed down on her. "So," a woman's voice drawled behind her, snapping Harper's attention away. She turned to see a tall blonde in a shimmering gown, her smile carrying more venom than warmth. "You're the woman who managed to snag Ethan Whitmore." Quite the accomplishment. Harper stiffened, recognizing the condescension. "I wouldn't put it that way," she said evenly. "Oh, don't be modest," the woman continued, her voice loud enough to draw nearby glances. "I mean, it's not every day a girl like you walks into our world." A flush rose to Harper's cheeks, but she kept her expression calm. Ethan and I understand each other. That's all that matters. The woman's laugh was icy. Of course. Though, I wonder how long that understanding will last. Before Harper could respond, Ethan's voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? His presence was commanding, and the woman's smug expression faltered. None at all, the woman said, her tone softening as she glanced at Ethan. We were just chatting. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Then let's keep it polite. His words carried an edge that silenced any further remarks. As the woman retreated, Harper exhaled, her nerves still frayed. Thank you, she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Ethan studied her for a moment, his features softening. You don't have to thank me. You didn't deserve that. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Harper couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's defense. Later, as they walked back through the quiet halls of the mansion, he surprised her with an unexpected admission. You remind me of someone, he said, his voice unusually introspective. Who? Harper asked. My mother, he replied, his tone tinged with melancholy. She had a way of standing her ground, no matter what. Harper glanced at him, catching a glimpse of vulnerability in his expression. For a man so guarded, it was a rare sight, and it made her wonder what else lay hidden behind Ethan Whitmore's composed exterior. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy silence filling the space between Harper and Ethan. They stood in the expansive living room, the fire crackling in the background doing little to ease the chill that had settled over their conversation. Do you even care about anything beyond your empire? Harper's voice was sharp, her frustration bubbling over. She had spent the day listening to Ethan's meticulous plans for an upcoming deal, his tone clinical and devoid of emotion. Ethan crossed his arms, his expression impassive, but his voice laced with an edge. My empire keeps thousands of people employed. It's not just about me. Harper stepped closer, her eyes blazing. You say that, but you treat everyone like they're replaceable. People aren't just assets, Ethan. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his tone was low, controlled. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The decisions I make aren't personal. They're necessary. Harper shook her head, her voice softer but no less firm. You talk like feelings don't matter, like nothing outside your controlled world can touch you. But life isn't a spreadsheet, Ethan. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Ethan's gaze faltered. You think I don't feel anything? He asked, his voice quieter now. You think I don't care? Do you? Harper countered, her heart pounding. She hadn't meant to push so hard, but she couldn't stop herself. The walls Ethan kept around himself were suffocating, and she wanted to break through, to see the person beneath the mask. Ethan turned away, his hand running through his hair in frustration. I care more than you know, he muttered, almost to himself. But caring doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring people back. It doesn't fix what's broken. The rawness in his voice caught Harper off guard. For a moment, she saw the cracks in his armor, the pain he worked so hard to hide. But before she could respond, Ethan straightened, his defenses snapping back into place. We're not going to agree on this, he said curtly, signaling the end of the conversation. I have work to do. As Ethan left the room, Harper felt a pang of regret, but also a deep frustration. She wanted to understand him, to connect with him, but he kept her at arm's length. Later that night, as Harper wandered the quiet halls of the mansion, she heard voices coming from Ethan's office. The door was ajar, and she hesitated before stepping closer. Margaret's pushing harder, Ethan said, his tone bitter. She won't stop until she controls everything. Another voice, one Harper didn't recognize, replied, You have to be careful. She'll use your father's secrets to turn the board against you. Harper's breath caught. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing. Secrets? She hadn't known much about Ethan's father, but this hinted at something deeper, something that might explain Ethan's guarded nature. As the conversation continued, Harper quietly slipped away, her thoughts swirling with questions. Whatever Ethan was hiding, it was bigger than she had imagined. And as much as she wanted to distance herself from his cold, calculated world, She couldn't shake the feeling that understanding his past was the key to breaking through his walls. For the first time, Harper wondered if their clash wasn't just about values, but about the ghosts they both carried. His, buried under years of silence, and hers, rooted in a need to connect. The mansion was unusually quiet as Harper set down a box of decorations on the polished marble counter. She glanced at the clock. 2 hours until Lily would arrive for her surprise birthday celebration. Harper had been determined to make the day special, even if the grandeur of Ethan's estate felt overwhelming. As she opened a package of balloons, she heard footsteps. Turning, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his sleeves rolled up, his expression curious. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the colorful assortment of party supplies that looked wildly out of place in the otherwise pristine kitchen. Harper hesitated. "It's Lily's birthday tomorrow. I thought we could surprise her tonight since she's coming to visit." Ethan nodded slowly. "You didn't mention this before." Harper shrugged, her cheeks slightly flushed. "I didn't think it was your kind of thing." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, to Harper's surprise, he stepped forward and picked up a string of paper garlands. "Where do these go?" "You're helping?" Harper asked, blinking at him. He smirked. "Why not? I've never decorated for a birthday before. Might as well learn." Harper couldn't help but laugh. "All right, let's hang these near the windows." They worked together, Harper giving directions while Ethan fumbled with the decorations. It was an odd sight. One of the wealthiest men in the country struggling to tape balloons to a wall, but Harper found it endearing. At one point, Ethan managed to pop a balloon with an awkward knot, and his startled expression sent Harper into a fit of laughter. "Stop laughing," Ethan said, his tone mock serious. "This is harder than it looks." Harper grinned. "I'm laughing with you, not at you." "I wasn't laughing," he countered, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. As they set the table with a cake and small presents, Harper noticed a shift in Ethan's demeanor. He wasn't the cold, detached man she had first met. In these quiet, unguarded moments, he seemed almost human. "Thank you," Harper said softly, catching his eye. "For this. It means a lot to Lily. And to me." Ethan held her gaze, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone betrayed the depth behind his simple words. As they finished, Ethan glanced at the small pile of gifts. "You've done all this for her. She's lucky to have you." "She's everything to me," Harper replied. "After our parents died, I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to give her a happy life." Ethan's expression darkened slightly at the mention of parents. "Your father, was he close to you?" Harper nodded, her smile fading. "He was. He taught me to fight for what I believe in." Ethan hesitated, then said, "My father was different. Strict. Everything was about the business. There wasn't much room for anything else." Harper studied him, sensing the weight of his words. "That sounds lonely." Ethan exhaled, a hint of vulnerability breaking through. "It was." Before she could respond, Lily's laughter echoed from the front door. Harper turned, her face lighting up as Lily ran into the room, her eyes widening at the decorations. "Happy birthday," Harper exclaimed, sweeping her sister into a hug. Lily's joy was contagious, filling the room with warmth. Ethan watched from a distance, a small smile on his face as Harper helped Lily open her presents. For the first time, the mansion felt alive, filled with something money couldn't buy, genuine happiness. Later, as Harper walked Ethan to the door, she paused. "Thank you again. I know this isn't your usual scene." Ethan looked at her, his expression soft. "It wasn't as bad as I expected." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable yet charged. Ethan's hand brushed against hers as he reached for the door handle, and Harper felt her breath catch. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, she thought he might say something. But then the moment passed. Ethan nodded slightly and left, leaving Harper with a racing heart and a growing realization. Ethan Whitmore was not the man she had thought him to be. Harper's fingers trembled as she turned the pages of the document she had stumbled upon in Ethan's study. She had been looking for a simple notebook to jot down a reminder when curiosity got the better of her. The folder, tucked beneath a stack of financial reports, bore the Whitmore name stamped on its cover. What she found inside left her breathless. There it was, in stark black and white text, details of a deal Ethan's father had orchestrated years ago. The business agreement, full of legal jargon, outlined a failed investment tied to a smaller company, her father's company. Her family's financial ruin had been the catalyst for their downward spiral, leading to the fateful accident that claimed her parents' lives. Harper felt like the walls of the room were closing in. She clutched the papers, her mind racing between disbelief and betrayal. It wasn't Ethan's fault. He would have been too young to be involved, but his family's legacy was entwined with the tragedy that had shaped her life. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Quickly, she slipped the folder back where she had found it and composed herself just as Ethan entered the study. He paused, his sharp gaze catching her startled expression. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "I was looking for a notebook," Harper said, her tone steadier than she felt. She held up the empty pad she had grabbed from the desk. "Found one." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "Dinner will be ready soon. I thought I'd let you know." "Thanks," Harper replied, moving past him with a forced smile. Her heart pounded as she exited the room, her mind consumed by the weight of her discovery. At dinner, the tension between them was palpable. Ethan noticed Harper's unusual quietness, her distracted responses to his occasional remarks. She wasn't one to hide her emotions well, and tonight was no exception. "You seem off," Ethan said. His fork paused midway to his plate. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," Harper replied too quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired." Ethan frowned, his instincts telling him something was amiss. Harper wasn't fine. He had come to know her well enough to recognize when something was eating at her. But instead of pressing, he watched her closely, his own thoughts simmering. Later that evening, Harper sat alone in her room, staring out the window at the sprawling estate. Gratitude for Ethan's recent kindness warred with the anger she felt toward his family's role in her past. She replayed every interaction with him, questioning whether he knew about the connection and what it might mean for their fragile relationship. Meanwhile, Ethan retreated to his office, his mind unable to shake the feeling that Harper was keeping something from him. He replayed the moment in the study, the flicker of unease in her eyes. Ethan was a man who thrived on control, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. As Harper lay awake that night, her emotions spiraled. She didn't know how to confront Ethan, or if she even should. The man she had started to see glimpses of, the one who defended her, helped with Lily's birthday, and showed moments of vulnerability, didn't match the image of someone complicit in her family's downfall. And yet, the connection was undeniable. The storm brewing inside Harper mirrored the tension building between them. It was only a matter of time before past and present collided, and neither she nor Ethan could walk away unscathed. The soft morning light streamed through the windows as Harper sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee. She had been lost in thought, her mind still tangled in the discovery of the documents and what they meant for her relationship with Ethan. The sound of a knock on the door startled her from her reverie. Ethan stepped in, holding a slim envelope in his hand. His usual composed demeanor seemed softer this morning, and there was a faint, almost nervous energy about him. "Morning," he greeted, placing the envelope on the table. "This is for Lily." Harper blinked, confused. "For Lily?" He nodded. "I did some digging into programs for her education. There's a private school nearby that specializes in working with kids who have her needs. They're willing to offer a full scholarship." Harper stared at him, her breath catching. "Ethan, I don't. Why would you do this?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table before meeting hers. "Because it matters to you, and because she deserves every chance to thrive." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, Harper felt the anger she had been holding on to slip away. "I don't even know what to say," she murmured, her fingers brushing over the envelope. "This means so much." "It's nothing," Ethan said, brushing it off, though the way his shoulders relaxed suggested her gratitude had reached him. Their moment was interrupted when Margaret entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Ethan," she said, her tone brisk, "May I speak with you?" Harper tensed instinctively, but Ethan gestured for her to stay as he followed Margaret into the adjacent study. The door didn't close all the way, and Harper caught fragments of their conversation. "This charity work you're doing," Margaret said, her voice laced with disdain, "it's unnecessary. You're going out of your way for her, and people are beginning to talk." "Let them talk," Ethan replied, his tone measured but firm. "I'm not asking for your opinion. She's using you," Margaret pressed, "and you're too blind to see it." Harper's stomach twisted as she heard Margaret's words. Her pulse quickened, wondering if they were getting through to Ethan. The doubt they could plant might undo everything. When Ethan reappeared, his face was unreadable. "Don't listen to Margaret," he said abruptly, as though sensing Harper's worry. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." Harper forced a smile, but Margaret's words lingered in her mind. If Margaret could manipulate Ethan, it might make him question her motives. That night, Harper found herself in the quiet of the library, sifting through old newspaper clippings and records. She needed to understand Ethan's family history, how much of it was tied to her own, and whether there were answers that could give her clarity. As she searched, she uncovered mentions of the Whitmore legacy, high-profile deals, personal scandals, and fragments of the story she had pieced together. Her heart ached as she read about Ethan's late father, a man revered for his business acumen, but criticized for his ruthlessness. The connections to her father's company were there, buried in the fine print, but Harper wasn't ready to draw conclusions. Not yet. Ethan found her hours later, sitting among stacks of papers and clippings. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, his presence startling her. "Something like that," Harper admitted, quickly gathering the papers. She wasn't ready to share what she had discovered. Ethan's eyes lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "Don't let the past keep you up. It has a way of stealing more from you than it should." His words struck a chord, but Harper couldn't heed them. The past was already stealing her sleep and threatening to steal her heart's trust. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows over the stacks of documents Harper had unearthed. Her heart pounded as she carefully spread the papers across the table, piecing together the timeline. The more she read, the clearer it became. Ethan's father had been at the center of the deal that had destroyed her father's company. The financial collapse had led to years of instability, ultimately culminating in the accident that had taken her parents' lives. Her fingers traced the lines of text, the words blurring as tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a mistake, but the evidence was irrefutable. Ethan's family, whether knowingly or not, had been responsible for the greatest loss of her life. Harper leaned back in the chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest. She had begun to see a different side of Ethan, a man who had shown her glimpses of kindness and vulnerability. But now, this truth threatened to undo everything. How could she reconcile the man she was beginning to care for with the legacy that had caused her so much pain? A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly shuffled the papers into a neat pile. Ethan stepped inside, his presence filling the room. He glanced at the table, his brow furrowing slightly. "Still working?" he asked, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. "Just organizing some things," Harper replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She avoided his gaze, afraid he might see the turmoil in her eyes. Ethan crossed the room, his movements deliberate. "You've been quiet all day," he said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Is something bothering you?" Harper's pulse quickened. "No, just a lot on my mind." His eyes searched hers, and for a moment, she thought he might press further. Instead, he nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "If there's something you need to talk about, you can tell me." "I know," Harper said, forcing a small smile. "I appreciate that." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "Dinner's in an hour," he said before leaving the room. As the door clicked shut, Harper released a shaky breath. She knew she couldn't keep this secret forever, but the thought of confronting Ethan with the truth felt impossible. It wasn't his fault. He had been a child when these events unfolded, but the legacy of his family loomed large. She couldn't ignore it. The tension between them grew in the following days. Harper's attempts to act normal were faltering, and Ethan was too perceptive not to notice. He watched her during meals, his sharp gaze catching every forced smile, every distracted response. It was unlike her, and it unsettled him. One evening, after another strained conversation, Ethan found Harper in the library. She was staring out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Harper," he said softly, and she turned to face him. "You're pulling away from me." She opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "Don't say you're fine. I can see that you're not." Harper hesitated, her hands twisting together. She wanted to tell him, to lay it all out, but the fear of his reaction stopped her. Instead, she said, "It's just a lot, being here. All of this is so far from what I'm used to." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "I know it's overwhelming, but it feels like there's more to it than that." When she didn't respond, he took a step closer. "Whatever it is, you can trust me. I'd rather know the truth than have you shut me out." Harper's throat tightened, and she turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan frowned but didn't push further. "All right," he said after a moment, "but don't wait too long. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." His words made her heart ache even more. She wanted to believe him, but the truth felt like a chasm between them. As Ethan left the room, Harper stared at the documents once more, her resolve hardening. She needed to find the right moment to tell him, but until then, she would carry the weight of the revelation alone. Little did she know, Ethan's patience was wearing thin, and his determination to uncover the truth would soon set their fragile bond on a collision course with the past. The air between Harper and Ethan was thick with unspoken words. They sat across from each other in the quiet study, the soft crackle of the fireplace the only sound filling the room. Harper had tried to avoid this moment for days, but Ethan's determination had finally cornered her. "You're shutting me out again," Ethan said, his tone measured but heavy with frustration. His sharp eyes searched her face, but Harper kept her gaze down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I'm not shutting you out," Harper replied quietly. I don't know how to say what's on my mind." "Try," Ethan urged, his voice softening. "Whatever it is, I want to hear it." Harper's shoulders sagged under the weight of his sincerity. She looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, she saw not the stoic, unflinching businessman, but a man trying desperately to connect with her. It was that glimpse of vulnerability that gave her the courage to speak. "I'm afraid of what I might find," Harper admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you, about your family, about us." Ethan stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You think I'm hiding something?" "I think there are things you don't want me to know," she said honestly. "And I don't know if I can handle what those things might mean." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "You're right. There are things I haven't told you, but not because I'm trying to deceive you. It's because I'm not proud of them." Harper's heart ached at the crack in his voice. "Like what?" "Like the fact that I've spent my entire life believing I had to be perfect to earn anything. Respect, loyalty, love." His voice faltered, and he looked away, the shadows of the room casting his features in sharp relief. "My father made sure of that. He always said weakness had no place in our family. So I buried everything. My doubts, my emotions, even my own sense of worth." Harper swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to be angry, to hold on to the betrayal she felt, but the pain in Ethan's words was undeniable. "I've spent so long building walls," Ethan continued, his voice quieter now. "But with you, you make me want to tear them down, and it terrifies me." Harper reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "Ethan, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be honest. With me and with yourself." For a moment, Ethan didn't move. Then, slowly, his hand turned to grasp hers. His grip was firm but trembling, as though he feared letting go would undo everything. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice barely audible. Harper shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "You deserve more than you think. But if we're going to make this work, we have to stop hiding from each other." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. "I'll try." Just as the moment settled, A sharp knock on the door broke the fragile intimacy. Margaret stepped in, her presence as unwelcome as ever. Her sharp eyes immediately landed on their clasped hands. "Well," she said with a cool smile, "am I interrupting something?" Harper quickly pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing. Ethan's expression darkened as he turned to his stepmother. "What do you want, Margaret?" "I thought you should know that certain rumors are starting to circulate," Margaret said, her tone dripping with feigned concern. "People are questioning Harper's motivations. They think she might have ulterior motives for being here." Ethan's jaw tightened, and Harper's heart sank. Margaret had always been skilled at planting seeds of doubt, and now she was targeting their already fragile trust. "That's enough," Ethan said sharply. "Harper is here because I want her to be. What anyone else thinks is irrelevant." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her smile never faltering. "Of course, dear. I only wanted to make sure you're protected." As she left, Harper felt the weight of her gaze linger like a shadow. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, and Harper could see the storm brewing in his mind. "She's trying to get between us," Harper said softly, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I know," Ethan replied, his tone cold. "And I won't let her." Despite his words, Harper couldn't shake the unease Margaret had stirred. She wanted to believe in Ethan, to trust that they could weather whatever storms lay ahead. But as she looked at him, his eyes hard and distant once again, she wondered if the walls he had built were too strong to tear down completely. For now, Harper decided to stay, not because the doubts had disappeared, but because she still believed in the possibility of the man she had glimpsed tonight. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Ethan's mansion, casting a deceivingly serene glow over the room. Harper was seated at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone, when a sudden notification made her heart drop. The headline on the news app was impossible to ignore. "Billionaire Ethan Whitmore's new wife under scrutiny. Is she in it for the money?" Her blood ran cold as she read the article, which painted her as a gold digger, using carefully cropped photos and fabricated claims. The story even referenced private details about her life, including Lily's medical condition, turning her sister's struggle into a weapon. "What's wrong?" Ethan's voice pulled her attention. He entered the room, his phone in hand, his brows furrowed as though he had already seen the same article. Harper set her phone down, her voice tight. "Did you see this?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's ridiculous. People will believe anything." "It's more than ridiculous, Ethan," Harper snapped, her voice rising. "They know about Lily. How did this get out?" Ethan stiffened. "I don't know, but I'll handle it." Harper didn't miss the hesitation in his tone. "You'll handle it? Like it's just another business problem?" "This is my life, Ethan. My sister's life." Before he could respond, the sound of heels clicking against the floor signaled Margaret's arrival. She entered the room with her usual air of authority, a subtle smile on her lips that only deepened Harper's unease. "Oh dear, I see the news has broken," Margaret said, her tone falsely sympathetic. "Such a shame when private matters become public." Harper's eyes narrowed. "You did this." Margaret feigned offense. "Now, why would I do such a thing? I only want what's best for Ethan. And frankly, I think the public has a right to know who he's sharing his life with." Ethan's jaw clenched, his gaze snapping to Margaret. "Enough." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her smile unfaltering. "I only meant to protect you, Ethan. You've always been too trusting." The words hung heavily in the air, and Harper felt the ground shift beneath her. Margaret's ploy was clear. She wanted to sow doubt, and it was working. Ethan's silence spoke louder than any defense. Harper stood, her hands trembling. "I won't be part of this circus. If you don't trust me, Ethan, then there's nothing left to say." "Harper, wait," Ethan said, stepping toward her, but she held up a hand. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep fighting to prove myself while your family tears me apart." She left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Ethan turned to Margaret, his expression dark. "What did you do?" Margaret tilted her head, her smile finally fading. "I ensured you wouldn't be blindsided. You should thank me." "You went too far," Ethan said, his voice low and menacing. You've always been manipulative, but this is a new low. Margaret shrugged, unfazed. You'll see that I'm right. She's just like the others. Here for the money, the status. Ethan said nothing, but the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior was palpable. He left the room, his mind racing. Harper's words echoed in his head, each one cutting deeper than the last. For the first time, he questioned his own role in the chaos. Had he been too passive, too willing to let Margaret's interference define his relationships? Harper packed her bag in silence, her movements mechanical. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She had believed that she and Ethan were building something real, but the cracks in their foundation had been too deep to ignore. As she zipped up her bag, her phone buzzed with a message from Lily. "Can't wait to see you later. Love you." Harper stared at the screen, her heart aching. How could she explain any of this to her sister? Lily had already endured so much, and Harper had promised to shield her from further pain. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated, then opened it to find Ethan standing there, his face etched with regret. "Don't go," he said simply. Harper crossed her arms, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Give me one good reason why I should stay." Ethan exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "Because I was wrong. About everything." Harper shook her head, her anger flaring. "You let her do this, Ethan. You let her tear me apart in front of the world." "I didn't stop her," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I need you to know, I never doubted you." She wanted to believe him, but the weight of the scandal and the humiliation she had endured felt insurmountable. "It's not enough," she said quietly. "I can't stay where I'm not protected." Ethan's jaw tightened, his desperation clear. "Then I'll fix it. I'll cut Margaret out. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that you matter to me more than anything else." For a moment, Harper softened, seeing the raw sincerity in his eyes. But the scars of the betrayal were too fresh, the wounds too deep. "I need time," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Time to figure out if I can forgive this." Ethan nodded, his expression pained. "Take whatever time you need. But please, don't give up on us." As Harper stepped out of the mansion, the weight of her decision settled over her. She wasn't sure if she would return, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan sat in his office, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a vice. The financial reports scattered across his desk blurred into meaningless numbers as his mind spiraled back to Harper's parting words. The memory of her broken voice echoed in his mind, every syllable a reminder of how deeply he had failed her. Margaret's schemes were unraveling everything he had worked for. Not just his business, but the fragile trust he had begun to build with Harper. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly powerless. But he wasn't willing to let Margaret's manipulation destroy Harper's life or Lily's. Determined, he picked up the phone and called a long-trusted advisor. "Schedule an emergency board meeting," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "And ensure Margaret is present." The boardroom was filled with tension the following morning, the heavy silence broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, her usual smug confidence radiating from her every movement. Ethan took his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "I've called this meeting," Ethan began, his voice calm but authoritative, "to address a matter that has put this company's integrity at risk." Margaret raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Integrity? That's a strong accusation, Ethan." He turned his sharp gaze on her. "It is. And it's one I don't make lightly." Ethan stood, sliding a folder across the table. "Inside, you'll find evidence linking Margaret to the leaks that fueled the recent tabloid scandal." The room erupted in murmurs as the board members flipped through the documents. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time, but she quickly regained her composure. "This is absurd. You can't prove any of this." Ethan leaned forward, his tone cold. "It's all there, emails, financial transactions, even a witness statement." "You've overplayed your hand, Margaret," she scoffed, her voice dripping with condescension. And what do you plan to do about it? If you remove me, you risk losing the family's majority stake. Are you really willing to make that sacrifice? The boardroom fell silent as everyone turned their attention to Ethan. His next words were calm but resolute. I am. Gasps rippled through the room, and Margaret's expression shifted from smugness to genuine shock. Ethan continued, addressing the board. Effective immediately, I'm relinquishing my inheritance and any ties to Margaret's control. This company will no longer operate under her influence. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. You're a fool, Ethan. You'll lose everything. Ethan met her glare without flinching. I'd rather lose everything than let you destroy the lives of people I care about. News of the meeting spread quickly. By the end of the day, Ethan's decision was public knowledge, and the media frenzy shifted from Harper to the fallout within the Whitmore empire. The mansion, once a fortress of control, now felt strangely empty as Ethan returned home. Later that evening, Harper received a call from one of Ethan's staff members. At first, she hesitated to answer, but curiosity won out. Miss Rose, the voice on the other end said, I thought you should know what Mr. Whitmore did today. The staff member explained Ethan's sacrifice in detail, how he had cut ties with Margaret, willingly giving up his inheritance to shield Harper and Lily from further harm. As the words sank in, Harper felt her breath catch. Ethan's decision was as selfless as it was reckless, and it left her reeling. Harper arrived at the mansion later that night, her heart pounding as she climbed the front steps. Ethan opened the door before she could knock, his face etched with weariness. Harper, he said softly, stepping aside to let her in. She entered the grand foyer, her emotions a storm of anger, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. Turning to face him, she asked, Why did you do it? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I couldn't let her win. Not at your expense. You gave up everything, Harper said, her voice trembling. For me. Ethan shook his head. It wasn't just for you. It was for me too. I couldn't live with myself if I let her destroy something good, something real. Harper searched his face, seeing the raw honesty in his eyes. The man who had once seemed so guarded now stood before her, stripped of pretense and pride. But the scars of her own pain ran deep, and forgiveness didn't come easily. I don't know if I can forgive your family, Harper admitted, her voice breaking. What they did to my parents. It's a part of me I can't let go of. Ethan nodded, his expression somber. I don't expect you to forgive them, but I hope you can find a way to forgive me. The vulnerability in his voice brought tears to Harper's eyes. She looked away, struggling to find the words for the emotions swirling inside her. She cared for him, but the shadows of the past were hard to ignore. I need time, she said finally, to figure out what this means for us. Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady despite the ache in his eyes. Take all the time you need. Just know that I'm not giving up on us. Harper nodded, her heart heavy as she turned to leave. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, she saw the possibility of hope, a fragile thread tying the broken pieces of their lives together. Ethan Whitmore stood at Harper's apartment door, the usually unflappable man looking almost uncertain. When she opened the door, her guarded expression mirrored the distance that had grown between them. I needed to see you, Ethan said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. To say what I should have said before. Harper crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. And what's that? Ethan stepped inside at her silent nod of permission, his eyes scanning the modest living room. I'm sorry, he began. For all of it. For not standing up for you sooner. For letting Margaret twist things. For making you feel like you had to prove yourself to me. Harper studied him, her heart battling the storm of emotions his words provoked. You let her ruin everything, Ethan, she said, her voice sharp with lingering pain. And I can't forget how that felt. I know, Ethan admitted, his tone raw, but I want to change that. I've already taken steps to make sure she can't hurt you, or us, again. What do you mean? Harper asked, her brows knitting in confusion. Ethan pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to her. I've cut ties with Margaret, relinquished my inheritance. stepped away from the company. Harper's eyes scanned the page, the implications of his decision settling in. You gave up everything. I gave up what didn't matter, Ethan corrected. You and Lily matter. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that if you let me. Harper's throat tightened as she looked at him, seeing not the aloof businessman she'd once met, but a man who had stripped himself of his walls. You're saying all the right things now, but I need to know this isn't just a moment. That this is real. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. This is real. No more walls, no more excuses. I'll fight for us, if you'll let me. Harper hesitated, her heart caught between fear and hope. But as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she saw sincerity and a willingness to rebuild. Not just for her, but with her. I'm willing to try, she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. But only if we do this together. Ethan's relief was visible as he nodded. Together. Always. As Harper let herself trust his words, a small smile broke through. Their future wasn't certain, but for the first time, she believed it was worth the risk. Together, they could face whatever came next. The early morning sun bathed the garden in a soft golden glow as Harper stood on the porch of the newly renovated cottage she now shared with Ethan. The house, nestled on the edge of a quiet hillside, was far removed from the grandeur of Ethan's mansion, but it felt like home, a place filled with love, laughter, and new beginnings. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of Lily's footsteps. Her little sister's energy had returned in full force since starting her treatment. The bright sparkle in her eyes, so often dimmed by pain, now radiated hope. Harper, look, Lily called excitedly, pointing to the freshly dug patch of earth in the garden. Ethan stood nearby, shovel in hand, a grin on his face as he waved at them. Ready? Ethan asked, his voice carrying across the yard. Harper nodded, taking Lily's hand as they walked over. The three of them gathered around the small hole Ethan had prepared, the roots of a young sapling waiting to be tucked into the earth. This tree will grow as strong as we let it, Ethan said, glancing at Harper. It'll take care, patience, and a lot of hope. Harper smiled at the metaphor, her heart swelling with emotion. Then it sounds like us, she replied softly. They worked together to plant the tree, each of them scooping handfuls of soil over the roots. Lily giggled as Ethan teased her about her technique, and Harper couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the once distant billionaire now kneeling in the dirt, his sleeves rolled up and his heart completely open. Later, as Lily ran off to play, Harper and Ethan sat on the porch, a quiet contentment settling between them. The tree stood proudly in the garden, its delicate leaves swaying in the breeze, a symbol of everything they had fought for. I never thought I'd have this, Ethan admitted, his hand finding Harper's. A life that feels real. Harper squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. You earned it, Ethan. You let go of what didn't matter and made space for what does. He turned to her, his expression serious but full of warmth. I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me what it means to fight for something worth keeping. Harper smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. And you taught me that letting someone in doesn't mean losing yourself. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The peace of the moment was a stark contrast to the turmoil they had endured, and it felt like a fitting conclusion to their journey. In the following weeks, the new rhythm of their lives settled in. Lily's treatments continued to show promise, and Harper found joy in running her small business, a cozy cafe in town where she welcomed friends and neighbors with warmth and sincerity. Ethan, now free from the pressures of his family's company, poured his energy into helping local charities, using his resources to make meaningful changes. Margaret, once a looming shadow in their lives, had been left powerless. Ethan's decision to sever ties had forced her into irrelevance, and for the first time, she was no longer a threat to their happiness. One evening, Harper and Ethan walked through the garden, hand in hand. The young tree they had planted stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, its presence a quiet reminder of the growth they had nurtured together. Do you think it'll grow tall? Harper asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Ethan looked at her, his eyes soft. If we take care of it, it will. Just like us. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "I like that." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. "Harper," he said, his voice full of emotion, "thank you for believing in me, for staying when it would have been easier to leave." Harper reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "Thank you for proving that you were worth the risk." In that moment, there were no lingering doubts, no shadows of the past, only the promise of a future they would build together. They kissed under the soft glow of the moonlight, their love unshakable. As the seasons passed, the tree grew taller, its roots digging deeper into the soil. Harper, Ethan, and Lily nurtured it together. Their bond strengthened with each passing day. The life they had built was far from perfect, but it was theirs, full of trust, love, and hope. And in the quiet moments, as the wind whispered through the leaves, they were reminded of how far they had come and how much further they could go. Together, they were unstoppable, their love a testament to the power of resilience and the beauty of second chances.